It's me, Peter Duncan from MicroSeismic Inc., and I'm speaking to you on what is usually one of my favorite days of the year. I should be addressing you in person. We should all be up at the Norris Center hosting or beginning what is, as I said, one of my favorite days of the year, our annual user forum, where we gather people from all over the country to talk about energy problems, geophysical problems, geological problems, and always have a lot of fun, and it's great to see you. Unfortunately, Mother Nature sent, I guess, what would be a bit of a nasty spring storm if we were in Denver or Calgary, but managed to be something that completely shut down Houston for 3 days. And in fact, even today, the roads are a little icy and it's a little bit dodgy getting around. So we had to cancel the event, unfortunately. I suppose there's a good side. I saved a bunch of money, but the bad side is I don't get to see you. The other side of it was as well that we had a large number of speakers who put together presentations I'm sure you would have enjoyed, and they worked on them, and we want to reward them. So over the next few months, we're going to host a number of these virtual sessions where the different speakers who put papers together will have a chance to present them. And I hope many or all of you will come back and spread the word that we're doing this. Uh, so we're going to do it in a format of Teams meeting. You'll have a chance to write questions in, and you can use the Q&A tab to submit a question while the talk is going on. When the talk is over, we'll go through some of those questions, and there'll also be a chance for you to raise your hand. And if we can figure out how to do that, we'll enable your mic, and then you'll have to unmute your mic, and you can give your question in person. I would like you to say who you are, where you are, and what you do for a living, like who you're associated with, so that Arjun will know who he's talking to. Now, I just let the cat out of the bag. Our guest today was our kickoff speaker from the meeting, Arjun Murti. And I don't know how many of you know Arjun, but he is a very, very passionate man. He's passionate about his family. He's passionate about his sports. He favors the New York teams, the Yankees and the Knicks, and he's passionate about golf. Now, how do I know so much about this man personally? Well, he does a fabulous blog once a week, sometimes in writing, but more often now as a video blog called Super Spiked. And if you haven't watched Super Spiked, I advise you to find it on the net and watch it weekly when it comes out. Typically comes out over the weekend. And in it, Arjun shows us, tells us all sorts of neat things. Now, sometimes it's a little wonky. Sometimes he gets into the economics and the ways that you calculate success if you're a financial analyst. But a lot of the time, he expresses his passion about the energy business, the oil and gas business, but the more broad energy business, and about its effects on the community. And I don't mean just the United States and Canada, but the world. He has a world view, and the facts and the figures that he gives us, the insight that he presents, I find amazing. So how does he have the right to do this? Well, for 33 years, he's been an analyst in the business. He worked first at Petrie Parkman, a firm I know up in Denver, then at JP Morgan, and spent the bulk of his career at Goldman Sachs, where he rose up to be a partner. He retired in 2014, and this is where the passion for his family comes in. He retired not to take another job, but to stay at home and be more with his family. And I applaud that. That was a fabulous thing to do. But the energy transition, and he doesn't like that term, but the energy transition starting in 2021 caused him to see an opportunity, a need for him to get involved in the business again. And he joined Maynard Holt and the gang at Veriten, where he's a partner. And he's now participating in the business with them. He sits on the board of ConocoPhillips. He's on the Energy Advisory Board for Columbia University. He is plugged in everywhere. He uses that passion to our benefit around the world. And today we're going to benefit from sharing a little bit, him sharing with us a little bit of his vision about the energy business here and around the world. And then he'll answer your questions. So with that, Arjun, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think you know which buttons to press in order to take over and share your screen and do all of the rest of it. And I'm going to mute my mic and take it away.
Well, thank you, Peter, and hopefully I think you can see my slides that are pulling up here. That's a super kind introduction. I want to say it is a pleasure to be here. I was going to make a joke about the Houston blizzard. I did live in Albuquerque for a year during my college years, so my father was at Sandia Labs, and I do remember the 1 inch of snow being the equivalent of about 2 feet in the New Jersey area where I live. So I hope everyone is staying safe and warm and all that kind of good stuff if you're in Houston. But as Peter mentioned, I'm actually almost, this March will be the 34th year of covering the energy sector. It is by chance, and I have to say that I'm really lucky and really blessed to have been involved with this sector. It goes through cycles. There are times it's in favor, there are times it's out of favor, but it is always interesting. It's always changing, and I look forward to kind of sharing some of my thoughts and clearly taking your questions in the back half. I will say as a disclosure, please blame me for anything I say. Don't blame any of my affiliations. I am here on behalf of Veriten. I am on the board of a couple of companies, and I do not speak on their behalf. I would refer you to their representatives. Again, this is all my personal views. As Peter mentioned, we have, for the last decade, I was enjoying this sort of post-Goldman life of doing a bunch of board and advisory work. It was something about that 2018, 2019 period where we started to get the language about the energy transition, which I think to most people meant we were going to switch out of fossil fuels, go only into renewables over some arbitrarily short time frame, like by 2050, and that this would be sort of free and easy. And there's sort of no part of that narrative that I thought actually made any sense. And it's so motivated me to first get on Twitter, and I enjoyed that sort of engagement. And then I ultimately started writing this blog that Peter referenced, Super Spiked. It's at arjunmurti.substack.com. It's also on the Veriten website. It is for free. It is sort of my take on how I think we can actually have healthier energy narratives. And if I kind of fast forward to today, I think the world is starting to move in a more pragmatic direction. And what I call kind of the energy transition, that very narrow definition about only out of fossil fuels into renewables, I think that is being put by the wayside. It never made sense. It was an inversion of the hierarchy of needs we have, which I will get into. And I think there's not a person or a country on Earth that ever prioritized net zero carbon emissions. That's not to say it's not a goal we perhaps should have. I think our environmental and climate responsibilities do exist. The question is how you get there. And I'm going to say that net zero ideology is what I really push back on. And I'll talk about how I think one can actually achieve both global wealth and ultimately better environmental outcomes. And my starting point is always, I know I'm amongst the lucky 1 billion people on Earth that enjoys full, rich lifestyles and all that we take for granted here. And we can debate things like, should we have net zero? Or should we have this goal or that goal? Should we drill, baby, drill? Or should we have stricter, auto emissions targets or what have you? There are 7 billion people in the rest of Earth who are striving to get to where we are, the lucky 1 billion. Of course, about 3 billion of those people are especially energy poor. And to me, there's little doubt that they're going to strive to get to our lifestyles. We can debate the timeframes. We can debate, can they do it in the next 10 years or 50 years or 100 years? But that is the direction of travel. One of the things that I think is going to bridge some of these gaps between, I'll just say, people moving to become energy rich, as well as thinking about our environmental and climate objectives, is the power sector. And it is, I think, one of the bigger changes that is going on right now. It is this generation super cycle. 20 years ago at Goldman Sachs, my career, it was about China and the BRICS and what that meant for commodity super cycle and oil super cycle. Super spike, I should say, was my call at Goldman 20 years ago, that oil was going to move from a $15 to $25 per range to ultimately over $100 a barrel. It kind of made my career, but that time is in the past. We are 20 years beyond it. And if anything, China is now decelerating and is going to be less critical going forward. It is now about power. Developing world, US, Europe, and so forth, we've got an aging grid. We've got growing intermittency on the grid. We've been prematurely retiring a lot of baseload generation. And the question is, how do you resolve for that at a time demand is picking up? Demand is picking up in the developing world for normal economic reasons. And all of this is being turbocharged by artificial intelligence, digital transformation, and all of those kind of mega tech trends. And I think power is really going to be a centering point as we look forward. And I think it's going to drive sort of all of the above perspectives on energy. What I will say, though, is I might push back on the energy transition and the idea that you should only go from, that you cannot go from fossil fuels to renewables only and do it on any sort of time frame that the proponents have targeted. I actually think it will be geopolitical security that will drive the development of non-oil especially, but perhaps also natural gas and coal technologies. There's going to be a huge motivation for countries that are especially poor or have insufficient amounts of crude oil, as an example, to, from a geopolitical security standpoint, to try and figure out how can we economically develop and not be dependent on imports, certainly from adversaries, but maybe even from friendly countries. Here in the US, last administration did a permit pause. How is that helpful to our allies? Right? So again, if you are a major importer of energy commodities, you're going to try and figure out new stuff. And I think that is going to be the motivation for new energies, not, in my opinion, counting carbon emissions. I will say, again, I don't like the phrase the energy transition, but energy is always changing. And I'll give you an example. In the 1990s, when my career started, we used to go visit Japan and South Korea and the Asian tigers to understand their oil demand trends. And we used to also visit Europe as well. In 1998, we had the Asian financial crisis, which marked the peak of sort of the Asia tigers and tiger cubs being the driver of oil demand. And they honestly never ever really came back. Their demand has continued to grow, but they never regained the focal point. Japan, no one talks about in terms of oil demand. Europe, no one really talks about anymore. And it turned out from 1998 to 2004, it was unclear what the direction and driver of oil demand was going to be. And we had a lot of talk of peak oil demand back then. Not as much as now, but some of it. And it turned out it was China in 2004 that suddenly took off. China is now slowing. And we actually don't know exactly what's going to replace it. It could be India. It could be other parts of Southeast Asia. But the exact timing is not so clear cut. So again, we're having some of these narratives of peak demand. My point would simply be, this business is always changing. We ramped up in the luxury vehicle market from 0 to 1/3 electric vehicles in about a 5-year period. That's a dramatic change. But that's also not the same thing as saying we're going to have 100% electric vehicles globally by 2035, as some are calling for 3 years. So you have to, I think you have to look at all these different areas and say, what is changing? What is real? What's not real? And we spend a lot of time on that. So let me spend a second on this hierarchy of needs, because the world has been upside down over especially the last 3 or 4 years, but frankly, it does date back to, I will call it the second half of the Trump administration, Trump 1, of 2018 and 2019, where suddenly everyone had to vow that they were going to be net zero by 2050. Every corporation, certainly in the developed world, to some degree in the developing world, and every country. And what that did was it prioritized CO2 over why we use energy in the first place. And I don't even understand. I get a lot of positive feedback on this slide. I don't understand why. Because how is there any doubt that every single person on Earth and every country on Earth only cares about reliability? When you turn on your light, does it come on? When you want to drive your car, does it move forward? That's all we care about all the time. And yet we have to learn it over and over and over again. Germany is my sort of case in point example, a country with particularly strong climate ambitions. And of course, what happens? Russian gas is cut off. Do they say, oh yeah, great, we're now closer to meeting our climate ambitions? No, of course they didn't say that. They started burning coal, and not just any coal, but lignite, the worst, most polluting kind of coal that you can have, right? Yet again, Germans, I'm an American, my parents moved here to go to college, I was born here. We are amongst the lucky 1 billion people who have those choices. There are the other 7 billion people on Earth who are striving to kind of take what we take for granted. I will say that affordability and geopolitical security come after availability. If the choice is to go without or pay a lot, you're going to pay a lot. Now, you can't pay a lot most of the time. You'd prefer energy be affordable most of the time. But if, again, if the choice is availability or you pay more, you're paying more. Same with geopolitical security. You will buy from your worst enemy if the alternative is to do without it. And those are choices we made as Americans in the post 9/11 period and throughout most of my life until the shale revolution. We were willing to buy from some not so great places because having the availability was more important. But you would prefer to have geopolitical security. You'd prefer to not be dependent on imports of any kind of commodity from, again, adversaries, but frankly, friendly countries as well. I will say in terms of our environmental goals, clean air, clean water, 100% positively correlated with being wealthy. Look at a map of air quality. It completely aligns with the map of actually fossil fuel usage. It's obviously not fossil fuels that clean the air. It's the wealth that is positively correlated that results in stricter air pollutant and water standards. Now, I will say biodiversity and low carbon is inversely correlated often with wealth. And I'm not sure amongst those things why biodiversity doesn't get more attention. And by the way, this negatively impacts some of the renewable targets. How is it that we're going to skip biodiversity considerations when we look at solar and wind as an example? But it's not just solar and wind, it's traditional fossil fuels as well. This should be, I think, a more prominent environmental objective. And again, when I get to low carbon, I will say again, no one on earth is solving for that without first having availability, affordability, and geopolitical security. However, it is that geopolitical point for countries that are short of crude oil relative to their ultimate potential demand, and to a lesser degree, natural gas, that will be the motivation towards figuring out new energy technologies. So these are a few graphs of sort of when you start moving up the economic S-curve, as you become richer, you use multiples of your original starting point of energy. Now, I do this in oil terms because I probably spent most of my career studying oil, and I find most people respond to the oil numbers. We could do this in total energy, and we'll probably shift to that. But if there's 100 million barrels a day in round numbers of oil usage in the world, it's 104 today. The lucky 1 billion of us, we use about 13 barrels per person. The other 7 billion people on Earth just use 3 barrels on average. And within that, you have billion person scale regions like India that uses like 1.4 barrels per person, maybe 1.5. The 54 countries of Africa, also about 1.4 barrels per person. And those are the two areas with growing population going forward. Africa is going to go from 1.4 to 2.4 billion people, and they're barely using a barrel per person. In lucky 1 billion countries, in the US, it's 20, South Korea, 22, Canada over 20, Europe's 10, Japan's 13, multiples of what the other economies use. And I love the example of South Korea. I'm 55 years old. They're the graph on the far left. When I was born in 1969, they were poor. They used 1.8 barrels of oil per person. You can see their Asia tiger growth in the 1980s, and it's continued to march higher. They have gone from poor to middle income to rich within my lifetime, within 50 years. Before them, Japan did it. From devastation, atomic bombs dropped on them at the end of World War II, 1945, to 1990, Japan went from devastated to buying properties in Rockefeller Center in New York at their peak. So you can transform countries within 50 years, but those are ultimately small countries. Between South Korea and Thailand, one of them has 75 million people, the other has 55 million people. Japan, I think, is 120. These are ultimately small countries. China is our first example of a billion person scale economy ramping up, and they have merely gotten to middle income levels. China today is using about 4 barrels of oil per person. Thailand, which no one thinks of as more important economically than China, or for that matter, richer, uses about 7 barrels per person. So China actually has a long way to go to catch up to us, which is why, and I'm going to skip ahead 2 charts and then come back. You look at China today, they're importing 12 million barrels a day. They're at 4 barrels per person, so it's the red line. China's importing 12 million barrels a day today. Their oil demand is just 4 barrels per person. If they simply got to Thailand's level of oil demand, you're talking another 10 million barrels a day. And that is their push to electric vehicles. That is their push to LNG trucks. It is geopolitical security. It's capital and trade flows. That is their motivation. I absolutely dispute they're doing it for, quote, climate reasons. And we know that because they are now 50% of global coal demand, right? So the idea that they're doing this for climate reasons is preposterous. They're doing it for geopolitical security reasons. If the whole world someday became rich, which to me is absolutely the goal, why should only 1 billion of us get to enjoy these lifestyles? Now, it's not up to us, it's up to them. And in part, do they have representative governments or governments that can help create conditions that lead to economic advancement? Unfortunately, that's not evenly spread throughout the world. It's quite possible. Countries like Venezuela and Iran aren't able to turn the corner for a variety of reasons. We worry about that in a lot of African countries. But I look at 1.4 billion people in China, 1.4 billion people in India, 1.3 billion people in the rest of Southeast Asia. At least that chunk of 4 billion people, I think, is unquestionably on track to move up economic and energy S-curves. If we were all similarly rich at 10 barrels per person, again, we're a little higher, 20, et cetera, you would have a 250 million barrel a day total addressable market for oil. Now, I want to be clear, that's not a projection of future oil demand. I think it does call into question how anyone thinks oil demand is about to peak. How are we energizing the rest of the world? What are they going to do? They're all going to drive electric vehicles? Really? With the power grids that they have? Right? Based on how much of them are in rural areas, how much of them are in cities. We can debate car penetration rates around the world. But to me, this is a total adjustable market for oil. And I ask everyone, how can they meet this demand by not using oil? And so I then get to the oil import numbers. This is US and Canada, which are the bluish lines, US dark blue, US plus Canada, the light blue, versus India and China's oil imports. China has freaked out at 12 million barrels a day of oil imports. And that, again, is their aggressive push to electric vehicles and LNG trucks. Look at the US. Prior to the shale revolution, we were at 12 or 13 million barrels a day. And every president since President Nixon has promised energy independence. And we finally achieved it thanks to the shale oil and gas revolution. We achieved it in 2023. Now, these are net. We import heavy oil, we export light oil. There are lots of pluses or minuses that I know this audience will appreciate. But from an aggregate perspective, we are in a significantly better position. And contrast that with China. We are their chief geopolitical rival. Their chief rival has shale oil and shale gas. And they've got mature fields in Daqing and some other areas. And they've always sort of, they have some gas production, but they don't have thousands of E&P companies and the kind of competition, capitalism, and minerals rights ownership and all these advantages of rule of law that we have to motivate the kind of shale revolution. We're not the only, I think this audience knows, we're not the only country with shale. It's the aggregate of what makes our country great that allows this kind of hockey stick to happen for our oil imports. This to me is the motivation for new energies. And if you're India and you're currently at 1.4, 1.5 barrels of oil demand per person, and you're already importing 5 million barrels a day, and you actually have less oil than China does, what are you going to do? And so for the foreseeable future, they're going to be importing more oil. But to think that they're not going to be highly motivated to figure out whatever comes next, how do we avoid some of the mistakes of SUVification, the heavying up of cars, which ruins fuel economy? How do you avoid that? And are they going to avoid that? What is the practical implementation of electrification in a country like India? What are the things we can't think about today? So over the next 10 years, their oil imports are only going up. But if you tell me 30 or 50 years from now, will that be the true? I'm not so sure. And I go back to the total addressable market. It's what we're trying to solve for. Where between 104 and 250 does the world settle out? We can speculate, does the world ever stop getting rich? I'm not going to talk about it here, but it does look like population will start rolling over in the back half of this century. So I think especially for people who are most focused on carbon emissions, I think your solution is going to be population rollover at some point in the back half of the century, as well as the motivation of countries. So I look at something like the IRA, or I look at something like the European goals. Who cares? We're 350 million people. Europe's whatever, 400 million people. It doesn't matter. You can have a view on it, you can like it, you can dislike it. What matters is what India does. What matters is what happens with the African countries. They are going to become rich. They're going to want to become rich. We do not live in a colonial era anymore. It's not up to us, it's up to them. And what path are they going to choose? You look at something like coal. So you see all this debates about peak demand for oil. Coal hasn't even peaked. I mean, coal has not even peaked. right? And most of this is China. That's the green line. The black line's global, the green line's China. Look at rest of the world, which is, not sure, mustard color, not a great color, but mustard. And India's the light green line. I mean, India's barely off the lows, right? India's got a ton of coal. So again, if you think about the motivation, I think it's be huge motivation for India to do solar. So actually very positive on absolute solar volume growth because it's a country with a lot of sun. Germany, not so much sun. India, lots of sun. But how are they going to base load it? What is going to be the, and I think you got to say, especially if you're environmentally oriented, why do we not think it's going to be coal? And and from an Indian perspective, it's inexpensive, it's domestic, it's jobs, it's taxes, it's bureaucracy, it's lots of things. Why are they going to displace their total addressable coal market potential with LNG as an example? They'll do some LNG, but it's not going to displace coal. How do you motivate this to roll over if you particularly care about the environment? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how you baseload stuff that's cheap enough to offset coal. Let me just spend a second. We obviously have a new administration here in the US, and I just had a couple more slides and happy to open it up for questions. It's sort of whether people like President Trump or don't like President Trump, I will say unambiguously, I'm a huge fan of Chris Wright. I don't know Governor Burgum as well, but that team I think is going to bring a pragmatism and a why we actually use energy focus back to the discussion. I'm a huge fan of Liberty Energy's Bettering Human Lives report that Chris Wright used to spearhead. And I think we're going to reprioritize, I think it's already starting, energy over climate. Again, I'll say it again. It's not that we shouldn't care about climate. I'm someone who does say, yeah, I think we're going to have to deal with carbon emissions over the long run. The question is how you get there. If you solve for everyone on Earth someday becoming energy rich, which is absolutely the direction of travel that every person on Earth wants, you then solve for geopolitical security and affordability, you will motivate new technologies. And that to me is how you solve carbon emissions. There's stuff we should take care of, like methane, that I'm a big proponent of proactively dealing with methane. There's some scope 1 emissions that should be proactively dealt with. But the overarching objective to me is always, how do we get to a world where everyone's energy rich? And what are the quantities of energy that then satisfy that? When I think of things like the Inflation Reduction Act, I think there's some positive things about it. Reshoring, I think, is now a bipartisan goal. Trump, in fairness, in Trump 1 probably started it. Biden continued it. And I think Trump 2 will continue to say, we need to reshore. We need to rebuild our industrial base. And part of that, one of the things we can do is things like the Inflation Reduction Act. But how do you change it so that there aren't mandates and there isn't excessive subsidization of uneconomic technologies? I am a skeptic of green hydrogen. I don't get how you take a bunch of energy to then convert it into a different form of energy, then convert it back. There's no part of that to me that sounds logical, least of all, if you're going to mandate it has to be, quote, green. So why is that getting such a massive subsidy? Why do we have an electric vehicle mandate, a de facto mandate via the fuel economy standards? I'm a very happy electric vehicle driver. I've driven a Tesla for 8 years. I'm not going back. I hate driving gasoline cars personally. Now, some people don't feel that way. I think it should be up to your choice. Also, as Peter mentioned, I'm a retired Goldman Sachs partner. I live in a house where it's easy to charge. I drive 1.5 miles per day, not a huge distance. Right? So for me, an electric vehicle works. That's not true for everyone. Don't mandate this stuff. Let markets determine what are our sources and technologies. And you can have big ramp ups unexpectedly. Shale, massive ramp up. Luxury vehicle, electric vehicle sales, massive ramp up. Let markets work. Huge competitive advantage through our oil and gas dominance. I think it'll be nice to have that come back. And I am a proponent of focusing on new technologies. I think solar's going to be a huge area. I don't know that we're going to dominate that per se. I don't know that the public companies that I get excited about in that space, but just in terms of gigawatts of power, I think it's a winning technology for a couple reasons. We may not like where the solar panel comes from, and I don't. Some people may feel differently. But once it's up and running in your country, it's a domestic resource. You're not importing the sun from anywhere else. And I would actually argue to solar advocates, stop calling yourself a climate action renewable. In fact, you're a geopolitical security energy source that if your country gets a lot of solar radiation, I'm thinking India, I'm thinking the Middle East, it is going to be and should be a big portion of your power mix. There is a zero variable cost aspect to it that I think is very positive. The question is always, how do you base load it? And how do you base load it if you do care about the climate, where it's not cold base loading your solar? And I think natural gas, I need to do work on natural gas with carbon capture. I have some friends that work at different firms who are big proponents of natural gas plus CCS. I've not personally penciled out the economics yet, but how do we have low cost, affordable, geopolitically secure, and then let's decide what the emissions profile should be relative to that. And I think the final point is just, we're going to close the door on the ideological aspects of net zero and ESG. I actually don't have a problem with ESG as an analyst. We used to care about things like governance. We used to care about the health and safety performance of the companies. If I had a refining company that I used to invest in, were they cutting costs or cutting costs too much where I risked the refinery blowing up? So we always cared about these elements, but it wasn't a religious cause. It was actually for the purposes of making sensible investments. So I think we're going to I think we're closing the door on what I'm going to call the the religious aspects of things like net zero and ESG, which again doesn't say that there's no aspects of it that make sense. Just a final slide that I wanted to go through, just really to talk about some of the key macro opportunities. I do think oil demand continues to grow for the foreseeable future. We're going through a sluggish GDP period right now. We're at a point in time where China is going from being a decisive driver of growth to merely another important country that's out there, and that's going to cause some noise and volatility. But I think there's always a need to figure out what comes next in oil. And so right now it's been shale. That won't last forever. Is it going to be Alaska? Is it going to be Canada? Is it going to be returned to deep water? How does the Arctic fit into this? These are all long-term questions. I think refining and midstream have a huge role to play as well in kind of the oil value chain. Electricity and petrochemicals look like they're going to go the fastest. So where in those value chains are there investment opportunities? Again, I don't think a lot of oil and gas companies necessarily need to get into solar as an example, but how, or power generation more broadly. But how do they think about perhaps optimizing the value of their natural gas molecules? Let's just say you're a Permian producer and you're getting zero or negative prices a large chunk of the time. We know there's a need for data centers and so forth. Where, are there opportunities is the question we're asking. We prefer super volatility as our macro backdrop. I am not, I should say, a believer in a commodity super cycle. So how do you think about incorporating volatility into your analysis of the firm? We believe in all of the above. And just the final point I'll say from a geopolitical standpoint, US, Canada, and Norway, huge allies. I think all three, I think we're going to have it in the US under President Trump 2.0. I don't mean to sound like, I think we're going to get it with Chris Wright and Governor Burgum. I think Canada is about to go through a political change. Norway will see. But these are really important counterweights to Russia, the Middle East, and China. And so let's embrace the energy that we have. And I think it's a critical thing we need to do. So there are a few other things in here. I'm also happy to talk about Veriten. I should probably just spend 1 second on it. I think a lot of you may know my colleague and Veriten founder, Maynard Holt from Tudor, Pickering Holt. We used to work together at Goldman Sachs 20 years ago. We have about 25 companies who we are on retainer for. We kind of position ourselves as the 13th board member or the 10th person in their corporate strategy development team to be as a sounding board to bounce ideas off of. We do help companies sometimes with strategic transactions, not as bankers, but again, as people who can be a sounding board. And we also have a fund, Next 10, that focuses on, in this case, non-oil and gas energy opportunities. And then separately as a partner group, we do have some direct oil and gas investments. So I'm going to stop there. Sorry, Peter, I think I went on a little longer than I intended to. Really happy to take any questions. So.
Well, thank you, Arjun, and you certainly demonstrated the passion that I advertised at the beginning of the talk, and it's one of the reasons I really enjoy your Super Spiked every week. You're always passionate and you're always informative. I have so far just one question that's been typed in, and people can type in more, or they can raise their hand and we'll enable their mic, and you can actually have a conversation. But I'll start with this the question from Rusty Gilbert. I know Rusty, he's an independent now, retired, and he writes in, Arjun, I love your overall global energy message. Do you think solar CSP, concentrated solar, will take off and be used? Referencing, he says, a company called Solus Power Company as an example, which is new tech. It's new to me, and I don't know if it's new to you, Arjun, but over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Rusty. And I should also apologize. I know I talk way too fast, but I have no ability to slow down. So I apologize for anyone who doesn't like sort of the New Jersey train of thought there. But it is new to me. So I'll just admit that I am unfamiliar with this specific technology. I'm actually going to look it up and do some work on it, but I don't want to miss the answer either. Again, I think solar, generally speaking, is something we are actually excited about from a volume perspective. I think we're always interested in looking at new ideas, so we'll try and do some work on it.
So we thank you, Rusty, for educating all of us. So over Nathan Meehan, who is well known, former president of the SPE and now a professor up at A&M. Nathan writes in, given the cost of carbon capture and storage and the apparent reliance on subsidies or carbon tax carbon prices, what are your thoughts on the relative value of, and it says see more, the relative value of CCS? Is this where we should be spending many billions compared to other investments? Will CCS be useful if you believe we need to address the unlucky 7 billion?
So probably a couple of different points and thoughts on this whole carbon capture thing. I will say that one area where I think I have common ground with those who are, climate action, environmentally focused, whatever the phrasing should be, is the idea that if one wants to be zero carbon someday, let's just take that as a premise. Let's just say one wants to be that. We can debate it, but let's just say that. I don't think you can carbon capture your way to that. To me, if net zero were our objective, I am skeptical that it's going to make sense to carbon capture the, ultimate emissions from 150 million barrels a day of oil demand, or wherever we end up, maybe it's 120 million barrels a day, whatever it is. I think the question is, how do we think about frameworks along the way? So I look at something like methane, which, as I look at the cost curve to do it, as I look at dealing with the energy needs of the other 7 billion people on Earth, this is a valuable resource. No one would say, I think in the oil industry, that it's okay to spill oil. Hey, yeah, there's some oil spills, it's fine, right? No one thinks that. No, you actually put in place this pretty strict containment system, double hull tankers, and there's been regulations along the way, some of which have been forced by government, some of which has been voluntary by all companies to not spill oil. We don't want to waste it, and it's been viewed as something that's environmentally incorrect. Is methane exactly the same thing as that? I don't think it is exactly the same thing as spilling oil, but it is absolutely a sellable resource. So if I just think from a moral perspective, and I think there's 7 other billion people on Earth who would love to use the natural gas that we're currently either flaring or venting or so forth, I support capturing it. The cost to do so has become more manageable. The technology around understanding it has become better understood. I think we could certainly debate what sort of regulatory framework should be. But if I was going to make a plea to the current administration, it's probably unlikely that Republicans will have unified House, Congress, presidency for the rest of time. And in fact, they may not even have it in 2 years. They may not have it in 4 years. And certainly by 8 or 12 years, it'll be some mixture. And it could even go the other way. But I think Democrats deserve credit that when they actually do stuff, they put in laws. One may have a view on the Affordable Care Act, but it's never been repealed. And look at how much Republicans campaigned against it. And they had a chance to repeal it and didn't. And I'm going to be skeptical the Inflation Reduction Act gets repealed. So my point would be, when you think of this carbon capture question, I'm going to answer as a broader carbon question, is what are the rules we should have in place for what is a solvable problem, especially when we have so many other billions of people on Earth, and as well as Americans and Canadians and locals who would love to use that resource. So it's an example of an addressable problem. I don't personally like forcing stuff, and it's expensive today, but what are the costs going to be going down the road? I think the last point would simply be is you're going to try and sell into different markets. So what do we think about Europe as a market? Do we want to say, you know what, I'm so sick of Europeans telling the world what to do. They screwed up, drawing lines after World War II. Look at all the turmoil and strife we have today. And I don't like their environmental, overlordism. Or do we want to say, you know what, it is actually a pretty sizable market, and whether we like it or not, they're going to have some carbon rules in place. So I think you just have to make these choices. Qatar's energy, I can't remember, the executive or the minister came out saying, hey, we're not excited about some of these carbon rules that Europe's enacting. We may sell our LNG elsewhere. I think that's a choice you're going to have to make. So when we look at carbon capture, I think it's going to be what does the buyer of energy want? Do European companies, Asian countries demand this or not? I don't think they're going to, but we're going to have to look at that. We'll see that right now. A huge thing are the data centers and technology companies. Are those companies going to say we're willing to pay for things like carbon capture? And so I think we remain open-minded about it. I don't think this is the way to net zero, though, is to think we're going to carbon capture all of our oil and gas. Hopefully that makes sense, my answer.
You bet. So I have a question from Zach Liu, who was one of our other speakers at the forum, and who is an active geophysicist active in the CCS business, but he's not asking you a CCS question. What he wants to know, he says, Arjun, it's a great talk. What is your view on the China-Russian alliance?
Well, it's an alliance probably made of necessity. There's clearly a logic to Russia being long energy and China generally still needing that energy, and if they're trying to diversify to within their own local, electrification value chains. I think it points to the importance of US, Canada, and Norway thinking proactively about their own energy. So I'll use the Arctic as an example. How can it be that the US, Canada, and Norway have said we don't get to have oil investment in our share of the Arctic? We can have views on what the cost that's going to be. Is it going to compete with the Permian Basin? Probably not today. But I'm looking 10, 20, 30, 50 years down the road when there might come the day where the Permian isn't growing by several 100,000 barrels per day per year. How can it be that we've shut off the Arctic to companies in our own countries, yet Russia is clearly going after their share of the Arctic? The Arctic is unquestionably warming. And we could debate the reasons. It seems like it's due to a changing climate, but for whatever reason, it's warming. Its strategic value is growing. Yet we've taken a very restrictive approach as a group of democratic allied countries, the United States, Canada, and Norway. And I think if I could have one hope for this Trump administration on energy policy, it will be recognizing the importance of the Arctic. That doesn't mean you have to develop every last acre, but we actually have a set of acreage set aside specifically for oil development, the National Petroleum Reserve of Alaska, which is now they're trying to treat as if it's ANWR, which is a totally separate issue. Well, this isn't about going willy-nilly all over Alaska, but it's figuring out oil is going to have to come from somewhere. It's not going to come from here. It's going to come from Russia. Is that better? It's going to come from Iran. You excited about that? How about Saudi Arabia? Are they friendly? I think they are, but maybe not always. I worked in New York. I worked right downtown during 9/11. Right? So is Saudi friendly or not? I think they're friendly. It's going to come from somewhere. It should come from our countries. And I support holding US, Canadian, Norwegian oil and gas companies to the strictest environmental and labor standards. By the way, stricter than you're ever going to see in Russia. Why is it okay to pollute in Russia, but we don't want our oil developed here? You talk about alliances, and I think it's a great question. I think so. What we've learned over the last 5 years, we learned during Russia-Ukraine that geopolitics absolutely matter. I think that's the number one thing we've learned. I think we're now learning, probably more through the power sector, that reliability is going to be the ultimate goal here. Reliability matters most, and then we're going to look at geopolitical security angles. So it's a really weird dynamic when countries try and cut off the knees of companies in their own country. You can be tough on them. No, I'm an analyst. We don't like every oil management team. They sometimes make promises they don't keep. Their stocks sometimes go down. I assure you, we have lots of issues with a lot of the management teams out there. But we'd actually like them to be better. We'd prefer energy companies actually outperform. We prefer they have good returns on capital. So if I'm looking at it from a geopolitical standpoint, hold them to strict methane standards, hold them to strict overall environmental standards, hold them to strict labor standards, American labor, paid appropriate wages, and let's not pretend we can cut it off here and it's not going to get developed elsewhere.
Great, thank you. So I've got a question here from Hani El Shawi, and Rob Stewart. They're kind of hitting on the same thing. Rob Stewart, who's another Canadian and a professor down at the University of Houston. I almost said University of Calgary. And both of them are focusing on nuclear. Hanny says, thanks for doing this talk, and I'd like to hear your views on fission and small mobile reactors. And Rob Stewart quotes nature by saying, no, nature teaches us that nuclear fission and fusion are the most energetic sources of power. And he asks, is it time to have a huge Manhattan Project style project to push nuclear fusion, put that man on the moon and get that energy out?
I think we're going to put a man on Mars, apparently. So I think it's a great question, and I actually neglected to mention nuclear in my talk. It's certainly one of the technologies that I think has gained as much momentum as any over the last several years. It's obviously longer term in nature. There's obviously some societal, I'm going to call it misinformation about the safety of nuclear. It's, I think by the stats, the safest technology. But if I'm being realistic, if someone built a nuclear plant right outside of my house here, would I be excited about it? Probably not. But maybe I wouldn't be excited about a natural gas plant either right outside my house. So I think one needs to figure out and recognize some of the societal issues. But yeah, absolutely, nuclear is going to be part of the mix. The early retirement of nuclear in Germany, arguably amongst the many, probably the worst of the many mistakes Germany made as a country. And then I look at what's happening in China. And I should mention that at Veriten, we have a colleague, Brett Rampell, who is Rampal, I have a friend, Rampal. Brett Rampal, who's an outstanding nuclear expert, and I always appreciate hearing him discuss this topic. But nuclear, I think, is going to be part of the solution going forward. We should for sure use some sort of Manhattan Project and figure out how do we do this better going forward. In fairness to China and to credit China, they're able to crank out nuclear plants at a rate that we're not able to. Same thing with the UAE. That's what I actually think UAE is one of these model countries going forward in terms of how they're thinking about a true all of the above energy strategy and progress. And they've had some success on this as well. I think South Korea's had some success. What can we learn? In our country, in the United States, we have these private utility model where one utility does a project. It's way over budget and way late. Perhaps managements can always deserve some blame, but we've got a regulatory apparatus that also is unhelpful. And I'm not an expert on all those topics. I refer to my colleague Brett or other folks who are. But how do we improve upon this? What are all the things we need to do to have safe, reliable nuclear? It is otherwise an awesome technology. It's long-term in nature. For ordering how to have our power mix be better going forward, again, I do think solar is going to be a huge part of the solution here. It's modular. On my house, I don't have it. I live in New Jersey. I don't know that it'd be great to have solar panels on my house here. But there's certainly places where it's modular and can make sense. And you can be sort of, if not off the grid, at least sort of less on the grid with solar plus battery. Probably more for affluent people, but it is something that you can't do with other technologies. And again, geopolitically secure, zero variable cost, huge positive attributes for solar, and you could build them quickly. Natural gas is next. I think it's going to be part of the solution going forward. And then nuclear fits in long term. And it is something that we for sure could use some version of a Marshall Plan or a Manhattan Project towards. And it's something we spend a lot of time on at Veriten and are quite excited about nuclear, but recognize it's long term. Sorry.
So Arjun, let me throw out two other sources of power. One that's been in the news just in the last couple of days, wind, and then geothermal that I know Chris Wright has made some investment in. So where do you see those in the mix? You haven't mentioned them today.
Yes, so I need to study more category. I'm going to actually put CCS in the category of, I kind of share I have probably the same sympathies that the questioner earlier had asked about, isn't this stuff expensive? Are we really going to do it? But I'm willing to concede I've not penciled it out myself, and I ought to do that to a greater degree. And I do have some colleagues who say it's going to work better than you think, et cetera. So I'll work on that. Geothermal is one of those areas where, as well as long duration storage, I'm going to put in the to be studied standpoint. Where is it going to make sense? And where it does make sense, here's a potential source of baseload, domestic, in this case, low carbon kind of power. I know there's a lot of optimism for geothermal. I'm not against or negative on geothermal, but think there's still some proof points that need to be happened to show that this really is going to be the enhanced geothermal. Is it really going to be economic and base load? But probably more to it, where does it make the most sense and where does it not make sense? And I think that so when you cover the oil sector, you know that there's low cost, medium cost, and high cost opportunities. You know the rock is not identical everywhere. You know that even in a great place like the Permian Basin, there's low cost zones, there's medium cost zones, there's high cost zones and regions and acres. And this applies to all the new stuff as well. One cannot just say solar or wind or any of these technologies. Where does it apply? German sun is no way it's the same as Middle East or Indian sun, right? Which is what was always so ludicrous about European, quote, climate policy. I get they don't have a lot of oil and they want to diversify, but to be only renewables makes no sense for most European countries given their latitudes. Right? Yeah, so I'm going to put geothermal in the bucket of open-minded to studying it. I contrast that with hydrogen, where I'm absolutely a skeptic. There for sure are hydrogen uses, and those niche uses I think will absolutely continue. But the idea this is going to be some ubiquitous replacement of gasoline or diesel or in the power markets, I'm going to say no way. Really, really skeptical on hydrogen, especially when we start attaching colors to it. Green hydrogen, again, no way. Come on, give me a break. Blue hydrogen, maybe in some cases. But again, I'm thinking of these as really niche specific uses, not as, hey, I'm Europe, and instead of LNG, we're going to use a bunch of hydrogen. That's ridiculous, right? The European hydrogen targets are absolutely ridiculous. And I'd love to be proven wrong on any of this stuff. I have no problem with being wrong, right? I'm willing to throw that out there, something we're really against. On wind, I think that's been more forced. And big wind does not enjoy the attributes that solar does. Solar can be modular. You can have it in your house, you can have it at different sizes. And in areas that get good solar radiation, there's going to be consistency there. Even if your overall utilization rates are much lower than nuclear, these other things, there's going to be a consistency there. Again, in countries like India and the Middle East, and maybe some of our desert areas, Arizona and Nevada and these kind of places, that I don't think you can say the same thing for a lot of wind. So again, wind to me has been much more overhyped than solar. And I think there should be a distinction. I think if I'm a solar person, I would want to distance myself from wind and not be tagged as though we're both renewables or we're both, quote, climate action technologies. I would suggest solar folks rebrand themselves as geopolitical security and zero variable cost for regions that get good sun. So it's not that wind's never going to work. Clearly, Texas is a place that has a lot of wind. But I'm not as bearish on wind as I am sort of hydrogen. But you know, I kind of get some of the negativity around wind right now.
So great, Arjun. So Dirk McDermott has just raised his hand. Dirk, we're going to enable your mic, and I think you have to unmute yourself, and then you can speak.
Great, thanks, Peter, and thanks for the great talk. I've always enjoyed listening to you in the past, so it's great. Just a quick question. How do you think the current administration should kind of message this more practical perspective to the public? And the reason I'm thinking that is you've got some probably the best resources in the DOE coming in that I've seen in kind of like my lifetime. And I don't think drill baby drill really resonates with the public. I mean, it may resonate with me or the oil patch, but there really is a much broader population you have to bring over. And energy tends to be very complex. And even as you talked about the pluses and minuses of all these things. And it just, the whole idea of human flourishing, I think, is a great idea. But I'd just be interested to get your perspective if you were giving advice to the larger group to like win over the whole population, not just Texas, Oklahoma, and Canada. So thanks.
Dirk, that's a really awesome question, and thank you for actually coming off video, and it's nice to see you. So thank you for the question. And your question is 100% why I write Super Spiked and what I'm most passionate about. I'm also, as I've written, not a politician, and I actually hate partisan politics, and I would never be on track to actually win an election. So when I look at a phrase like drill baby drill, I think I share your exact sentiments. I think it's kind of funny. It's not a phrase I would have come up with when Trump first came up with it. I thought, drill baby drill, really? I mean, I'm a Wall Street guy where we generally are preaching capital discipline, so we're usually preaching, returns baby returns, not drill baby drill. And practically speaking, I don't think they can affect drill baby drill in the private enterprise system we have. On the other hand, if it's symbolic of we're going to embrace as opposed to attack oil and gas, if I look at it in that lens, I can probably live with it. But you're asking a much bigger question. So I look at topics like, and I'll apologize a little bit since not everyone knows me and my exact views on this stuff, but if people are pushing back on ESG, DEI, and all these acronyms, my personal view is the anti-versions of those are not the answer either. And there is risk for sure that the current administration, whether I like Chris Wright, whom I love Chris Wright, but whatever I think of him, it's not his party. He's not the president, right? It's going to be It's President Trump's rhetoric and party, and whether Trump can't run again, I don't think. Someone else is going to inherit some of the same phraseology. Energy is very nuanced. It's very complex, and people don't respond to that either. People do not respond to the economics of sort of, the wolf can't be, versus, the wolf can't, like no one responds to that. It's actually the problem this industry's had. It's mostly been run by engineers who are the worst public talkers on earth. I really enjoy dealing with oil company executives. I've been blessed to talk to them, but they are very different than, say, tech executives, and they've got some challenges now, but those executives tend to be, they all have consumer-facing businesses. We do not. Even if you own a gas station, it's going to be owned by not you, it's franchised out. And so the ability to communicate complex energy issues, the industry does poorly, politicians do poorly. Energy transition, piece of cake, just get out of fossil fuels into renewables. Solar's the cheapest right now. Why wouldn't everyone pick? Like, there's ridiculousness on all sides, including on the right, even if I might be slightly more sympathetic to right of center than left of center personally, if I'm being honest about it. I think Chris Wright is uniquely a great communicator on this. I'm sure, and it sounds like you would know, Bettering Human Lives. It's an awesome framework. He obviously knows nuclear, he knows geothermal, he knows solar. It's actually not the role of Department of Energy Secretary to do any of this stuff, actually, but I think he will be empowered to become it. I think it's upon all of us. Again, I'm a former Wall Street analyst. I'm now at Veriten. I did feel an obligation, and I was in a position where I was very fortunate for my Goldman career that I didn't have to have like a 24/7 kind of job anymore. But I felt like, hey, I know something about energy, and I know what they're saying about energy transition is a bunch of nonsense, and it's not going to work. Even if you're a diehard environmentalist, that is not going to get you your environmental outcomes. So I felt compelled to talk about it, and more people need to do that. But there's an engineering speak that is challenging, and I think there's a pragmatic, how do you resonate with people? And so again, I'll push back on anti this, anti that as the counterpoint to the left's extremes. And I think there's real risk that happens. The nuance and complexity of energy, and if I go back to Chris Wright's view, how do you get everyone to be energy rich? I don't even like the language when people tell me, hey, Arjun, you're very passionate about poverty reduction. I'm not passionate about poverty reduction. I'm passionate that my parents came to this country and I'm a huge beneficiary of them having chosen to live here and me being able to go from parents who came to this country with $10 in 2 suitcases, and I'm a retired Goldman partner who drives a Tesla in 1 generation. I'm passionate about why should only I benefit from that? Why should only my 3 children benefit from that? Everybody wants this. We're not trying to reduce poverty. We're trying to make everybody energy rich. And I think there's but it's not easy. And it's not only oil and gas. And it's not only solar, it's not any of these things. I think I will take some hope when I go to college campuses and talk to people. I've spoken at Columbia, NYU, TCU, Denison, so a mixture, and there's 3 or 4 others, middle of the country, but also kind of East Coast liberal schools. I find the students are actually just looking for information. And even at a place like Columbia, actually my favorite talk. It was a global group of students, and I think they were relieved to hear a different view than that the world is going to catch on fire, we're all going to die soon. And I don't mean to make fun of it, but they actually appreciated the pragmatism and nuance. We all
So what I'm hearing from you is that we all need to play a bigger role, that we shouldn't use engineers, we should use geophysicists like Chris Wright and Peter Duncan, and go out there and get the story out, is what I'm hearing. But
absolutely, I engage with Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy, and while it is nonpartisan, if you look at the backgrounds of the vast bulk of the people there, they worked in the Obama and previously Clinton administration. So there is a worldview that is very different than my own. And I enjoy the discussion and debate, and my views are better served by it. So I deal with folks, it's probably an oxymoron, but moderate NGOs. I have an annual dinner. I don't want to out him so that he doesn't get to tag with me, with someone who works in one of those NGOs and he lives near my town. And we have polar opposite worldviews. He would be like, you're talking about the Arctic, you're out of your mind, et cetera, et cetera. You need to engage. It's up to everybody. And it can't just be yelling at your screen, right? And so, and I think we need to bring more people along who are not in the industry. And again, with all due respect to engineers, they're not good communicators, as a general comment. So it might not be even geophysicists. It could be other folks within the organizations. I think CEOs need to speak up. Chris Wright is the only CEO. What did oil companies do? They have these stupid ESG reports that say, oh, we're not as evil as we think you are. They are all, I'm against almost every oil company ESG report because they're all appeasement. They're appeasements is what they are. The only one who stuck up for himself is Chris Wright. Toby Rice does that as well. He does it in a different way. Chris Wright is the only one who makes the case for energy. Every other ESG report is, here's our net zero promise. Here, here's we're spilling less water, blah, 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 blah. Industry can't even stick up for itself. And where's the API on all this? I'm sorry, I'm going down. Where's the API
Go
on
ahead,
this?
Arjun.
We don't need anti-Biden rules. We don't need pro-Trump rules. If we can figure out how to case a well, can we not figure out what makes sense for methane? There's a need to be pragmatic about it. There'll be a portion of people who say, oh, methane's stupid to focus on. How can it make such a difference? No problem if you have that view. That's not a pragmatic view. Republicans will not win for the rest of time. There will be another Democratic administration that comes in, and they absolutely are going to put in methane rules. So what can we do as an industry to be proactive on what makes sense? What is the right regulation? I don't know that I have the answer. It wasn't the Obama rules. Those have been bad rules. It's probably something directionally that Biden wanted to do, but it's not exactly what he did. What should we be doing on methane? And not just pretend, oh, it's a trace gas, who cares? You can have that view, I don't care. The Democrats are going to win again. We need to put in laws or at least self-regulation. Sorry, Derek, I love your question.
No, I can tell that. Thank you. I appreciate it.
So, folks, there are a couple of questions out there and someone raised their hand, but my contract with the audience and with Arjun is that we would stop after 1 hour, and I'm going to live by that contract. Arjun, if you were here, as I had hoped you might have been, I would be shaking your hand and thanking you for a fabulous hour, for causing a great deal of thought to go through all of this. And I encourage everybody to find his Super Spiked blog and watch his videos. You get more of this with a bit of math every now and then. You get more of this all the time. Arjun, I would be handing you, and I don't know if you can see this, but it's the speaker's gift. I'm trying to hold it up in front of the, I don't know.
I can see it. That's awesome. That's very kind of you.
It's a light bulb.
Yeah.
It's a light bulb with a little inscription on it, but it was our speaker's gift to you, and we're going to ship it to you. We'll wrap it up and ship it to you. But again, thank you to you and to all of the audience for kicking off what's now going to be not our user forum day, but a series of user forum broadcasts over the next 6 months. And in the meantime, I look forward to seeing your next Super Spike, Arjun. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you.